Imin, Tata, Enel are the earliest named leaders preserved in the Cuiviénen tradition, the tradition of the Elves awakening at Cuiviénen on the shores of a great lake in the far east of Middle-earth. Imin, whose name means first, woke with his companion Iminye, and the two of them gathered 12 additional elves into their company. Tata and Tatia woke next, and their group grew to 9 pairs. Enel and Eneli followed, collecting 6 more pairs. These 3 leaders and their companions formed the original nuclei from which the Eldar would later organize themselves. The Cuiviénen material is preserved as an internal legend within Tolkien's legendarium, and it gives these 3 figures a narrative function rather than a genealogical one. They are not presented as the biological ancestors of every elf who would ever live, but as the first named individuals to wake, to find each other, and to begin forming communities at the waters of Cuiviénen. The summons to Valinor came later, delivered by Orome, the Valar who had discovered the elves. 3 elves were chosen as ambassadors to travel to Aman and report back: Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë. Ingwe led the Vanyar, the smallest of the 3 kindreds, and his people travelled to Valinor and remained there. Finwë led the Noldor, the kindred that would become renowned for craftsmanship and for the tragic revolt that followed. Elwë and his brother Olwë led the Teleri, the largest and most reluctant of the 3 hosts. Elwë himself never completed the journey to Aman. While travelling through the forests of Beleriand, he encountered Melian, a Maya, in the woods of Nan Elmoth. He stopped, transfixed by her song, and remained in Middle-earth. His long absence led the Teleri to search for him, and when he did not return, Olwë took the greater part of the Teleri across the sea to Valinor. Elwë emerged from Nan Elmoth transformed. He became Thingol, king of the Sindar, the grey elves of Beleriand, and ruled the kingdom of Doriath with Melian at his side. His separation from the great journey created the first major division among the Eldar, those who reached Aman and those who remained in Middle-earth under a king who had chosen to stay. Lenwë led another group of Teleri away from the great journey before the host reached the sea. His people turned southward along the Anduin and became the Nandor, elves who never entered Valinor and never came under Thingol's rule in Beleriand. Denethor, a later leader among the Nandor, eventually brought a portion of his people westward into Beleriand and settled in Osiriand, the land of 7 rivers. These elves became known as the Lyquendi, the Green Elves. Denethor's arrival in Beleriand placed a new elven community on the western map, distinct from both the Sindar of Doriath and the Noldor, who would later return from Aman. The divisions among the Eldar were shaped by the summons and the journey, as well as by the specific choices of named leaders at every fork in the road. Ingwe's Vanyar went to Aman and stayed. Finwë's Noldor went, and many returned. Elwë's Teleri split, with Olwë reaching Aman and Elwë remaining to become Thingol. Lenwë's Nandor diverged entirely, and Denethor's Lyquendi arrived in Beleriand by a separate path. Every named elven community in Middle-earth traces back to one of these separations. Finwë was the first king of the Noldor in Aman, and his family became the axis around which the entire Noldoran narrative turns. He married Miriel Therind, and she bore him a single son, Fëanor, before her spirit departed her body, and she went to the gardens of Lorien to rest. Miriel's death was the first of its kind among the elves, and it left Finwë alone. He later married Indis of the Vanyar, and she bore him 2 sons, Fingolfin and Finarfin. This second marriage and the half-sibling relationship it created between Fëanor and his younger brothers became a source of lasting tension within the royal house. Fëanor was the eldest and the most gifted craftsman among the Noldor, but he regarded Indis and her children as intruders into his mother's place. The friction between Fëanor and Fingolfin sharpened over years and decades in Valinor, and it preceded the darker events that followed. Fëanor married Nerdanel, daughter of the smith Martan, and she bore him 7 sons. Nerdanel is named in the published Silmarillion as his wife, and the narrative gives no portrait or invented motive for her character, beyond the fact that she alone could restrain Fëanor in part, and that even she was eventually unable to hold him back from the path he chose. Fingolfin married Anaier, and she bore him 4 named children, Fingon, Turgon, Aredel and Argon. Anaier remained in Aman when Fingolfin led the Noldor into exile. Finarfin married Eowyn of the Teleri, and through her he maintained a connection to Olwë's house. Eowyn bore him 4 named children, Finrod, Angrod, Egnor and Galadriel. Finarfin's children thus carried both Noldorin and Telerin lineage, and this Telerin connection would later matter when Finrod sought passage and alliance in Beleriand. The death of Miriel and Finwë's decision to marry again planted the seed of Fëanor's isolation. He grew up brilliant and proud, and his greatest achievement was the creation of the Silmarils, 3 jewels that captured the light of the 2 trees of Valinor. When Morgoth destroyed the trees and stole the Silmarils, killing Finwë in the process, Fëanor's grief and fury drove him to rebellion. He swore the oath with his sons, seized the ships of the Teleri at Alcolond, and led the Noldor back to Middle-earth. Finwë's death at Morgoth's hands was the first killing of an elf by a Dark Lord in Aman, and it set the Noldor on their road to exile. Fingolfin followed Fëanor, not out of loyalty but because his own people demanded it, and the 2 hosts crossed into Middle-earth by different and terrible routes. Finarfin turned back and remained in Aman, eventually ruling the Noldor who stayed behind. The 3 branches of Finwë's house thus split across the sea: Fëanor's line in exile and war, Fingolfin's line in exile and kinship, and Finarfin's line in Aman and later return. Every Noldorin king who would rule in Middle-earth descended from one of these 3 branches, and the tensions among them shaped the politics of Beleriand for centuries. Fëanor's sons were 7: Maedhros, Maglor, Celegorm, Caranthir, Curufin, Amrod, and Amrys. They swore the oath of Fëanor alongside their father, binding themselves to pursue any who held the Silmarils, whether Vala, elf, man, or demon. The oath drove every major decision they made for the remainder of the First Age. After Fëanor's death in the Battle Under Stars, Maedhros, the eldest, became the leader of the sons. He was taken captive by Morgoth and hung by the wrist from a cliff on Thangorodrim. Fingon, Fingolfin's son, rescued him by cutting off his hand above the wrist, and Maedhros later yielded the high kingship of the Noldor to Fingolfin, partly as recompense for the pain his family had caused Fingolfin's host, and partly because the mutilation had left him unable to wield a sword with his right hand. Maedhros ruled no kingdom, but led the eastern front against Morgoth from the hill of Himring. Maglor, the second son, was a singer and poet. He held the lands around the gap of Maglor's defile and guarded the eastern marches. After the 3rd kinslaying at the havens of Sirion, Maglor took pity on the twin sons of Eärendil, Elrond and Elros, and fostered them rather than killing them as the oath demanded. This act of mercy is the last recorded action of Maglor in the published narrative. He cast one of the Silmarils into the sea after the oath had driven him to its final breaking point, and he wandered the shores singing in grief. Celegorm, the 3rd son, was a hunter and a friend of the hound Huan. He and Curufin, the 5th son, seized control of Nargothrond during Finrod's absence and ruled it through fear and manipulation. When Beren arrived seeking help, Celegorm and Curufin betrayed him and sent him to his likely death. Their actions in Nargothrond led to their eventual expulsion by Orodrith, who reclaimed the city after Finrod's departure. Celegorm and Curufin fled and rejoined Maedhros. Caranthir, the 4th son, ruled the lands of Thargalion in the east and was known for his harsh temper. He dealt with the dwarves of the Blue Mountains and traded goods with them, and his realm became one of the few places where elven-dwarven commerce was regular and organized. Caranthir also gave aid to Halith and her people, the Haladin, when they were beset by orcs, allowing them to settle in his lands in exchange for mutual defense. Curufin, the 5th son, was the most skilled smith among Fëanor's children, and the most like his father in craft and temperament. He fathered Celebrimbor, who would later become the mastersmith of Eregion in the Second Age. Celebrimbor's connection to the Fëanorian line runs through Curufin, not through any other branch. Amrod and Amras, the youngest twins, are named in the published narrative as the 7th and 6th sons. They participated in the kinslayings and followed their brothers through the wars. The oath consumed all 7 sons across centuries of conflict, and its demands did not distinguish between the eldest and the youngest. Fingolfin's house held the high kingship of the Noldor in Middle-earth for most of the First Age. Fingolfin himself crossed the Helcaraxe, the grinding ice, with his followers after Fëanor abandoned them and sailed the stolen Teleri ships to Middle-earth without them. The crossing killed many of his people, and those who survived arrived in Beleriand hardened and diminished. Fingolfin marched to the gates of Angband and challenged Morgoth to single combat. He wounded the Dark Lord 7 times before Morgoth crushed him beneath his shield and killed him. Fingolfin's body was rescued by Thranduil, the eagle, and buried on a peak in the encircling mountains. His challenge to Morgoth after the Dagor Bragolach, the Battle of Sudden Flame, was the most direct confrontation between an elf and a Valar in the entire legendarium. Fingon, Fing's eldest son, succeeded him as High King. Before the wars, Fingon had rescued Maedhros from Thangorodrim, and this act of mercy helped heal the breach between the two Noldorin houses. Fingon led the Noldor in the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and died there when Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, struck him down. Turgon, Fingolfin's second son, had founded the hidden city of Gondolin in the encircling mountains. Turgon's city was the last great Noldorin stronghold to fall in the First Age. Idril Celebrimbor was Turgon's daughter, and she married Tuor, a man of the House of Hador. Their son Eärendil would later sail to Valinor and obtain the aid that led to the War of Wrath. Aradhel, Fingolfin's daughter, was called Arfaniel, the White Lady of the Noldor. She left Gondolin against Turgon's wishes and travelled into the wild, where she encountered Eorl, a dark elf of Nan Elmoth. She married Eorl, and their son was Maeglin. Maeglin grew up under Eorl's dark influence, and later came to Gondolin, where he was accepted into Turgon's court as a prince of the Noldor. Maeglin's betrayal of Gondolin to Morgoth, driven by his desire for Idril and his jealousy of Tuor, exposed the city's location and led to its destruction. Maeglin died during the fall of Gondolin, thrown from the walls by Tuor. Argon, Fingolfin's youngest son, is named in the legendarium as the fourth child. He died in the early battles of the Noldor in Beleriand, killed by orcs at the Battle of the Lamorth during the landing from the Helcaraxi. Finarfin's house produced the rulers of Nargothrond, and the one elf who would survive from the First Age into the Third. Finarfin himself returned to Aman after the kinslaying at Alqualond, and he was pardoned by the Valar. He remained in Valinor, and eventually ruled the Noldor, who had not gone into exile. His children chose differently. Finrod, the eldest, travelled to Middle-earth and founded the underground fortress of Nargothrond in the caves of the Narog. He was called Felagund, the cave-hewer, by the dwarves who helped him build it. Finrod befriended Beor and his people, the first men to enter Beleriand, and gave them lands in his domain. When Beren, Beor's descendant, came to Nargothrond seeking help in his quest for a Silmaril, Finrod gave him his ring and departed with a small company. Celegorm and Cuiviénen, who had seized control of Nargothrond in Finrod's absence, refused to help and worked to ensure Finrod's failure. Finrod died in Tol Ingoroth, the Isle of Werewolves, where he fought and killed a wolf to save Beren's life. He died in the dark, in a pit, fulfilling his oath to Beor's house. Angrod and Egnor, Finarfin's second and third sons, held the northern slopes of Dorthonion. They both died in the Dagor Bragolach, the Battle of Sudden Flame, when Morgoth's rivers of fire overwhelmed the highlands. Orodreth, who is named in the published Silmarillion as a son of Finarfin, ruled Nargothrond after Finrod's departure. He was a weaker king than Finrod, and he allowed Celegorm and Cuiviénen to dominate his court until their betrayal of Beren became known. After their expulsion, Orodreth ruled alone until the dragon Glorfindel destroyed Nargothrond. Finduilas, Orodreth's daughter, loved Gwyndor, an elf who had been captured in the Dagor Bragolach and who escaped Angband after years of torment. Gwyndor returned changed, diminished in body and spirit. After Nargothrond's fall, Finduilas was killed by orcs, and her death is recorded in the narrative as a specific and tragic loss. Galadriel, Finarfin's youngest child and only daughter, crossed the Helcarax or travelled by another route into Middle-earth. She survived the First Age, the Second Age, and most of the Third Age. Her early chronology has variant accounts in Tolkien's writings, and the published narrative does not settle every detail of her departure from Aman or her early travels in Middle-earth. Celebrimbor, the smith of Eregion, is Cuiviénen's son, and therefore a descendant of Fëanor's line, not a member of Finarfin's house. Thingol's court was the Sindarin kingdom of Doriath, ruled by Elwë, who became Thingol, and Melian, a Maiar. Melian is not an elf. She is one of the Maiar, the same order of being as Sauron and the wizards, and her marriage to Thingol placed a divine power at the heart of an elven kingdom. Melian wove a girdle of enchantment around Doriath, the girdle of Melian, which prevented any enemy from entering uninvited. Luthien, their daughter, was elven through Thingol and Maiar, descended through Melian. Luthien's story is told in the Tale of Beren and Luthien, and she is the most prominent figure in the Doriath narrative. Nimloth married Dior, Lúthien's son, and was part of the later royal house of Doriath. Dior himself is a Peridil, a half-elf, and his sons Elored and Elurien are also Peridil, not roster elves. Daeron was Thingol's minstrel and the inventor of the Curth, the runic alphabet that the elves created and that later spread to other peoples. Daeron loved Lúthien and betrayed her secret meetings with Beren to Thingol, which set in motion the quest for the Silmaril. Beleg Cuthalion was a great archer and swordsman of Doriath who befriended Turin Turambar. Beleg found Turin after Turin had fled Doriath and lived as an outlaw, and he brought Turin the sword Anglachel, forged by Eol. Beleg was killed by Turin in a tragic accident when Turin, delirious from captivity, mistook him for an enemy. Mablung was a captain of Thingol's guard and served the king throughout the wars. He participated in the hunting of the great wolf Carcharoth and was killed in the destruction of Doriath by the dwarves of Nogrod. Nellis was an elf of Doriath who knew Turin in his youth and later testified at the trial concerning Saros. Saros was a courtier of Thingol who provoked Turin and died after Turin chased him through the woods and he fell from a cliff. Eol was a dark elf who lived in Nan-Elmoth. He was not part of Thingol's court, but was a related figure in the broader Sindar narrative. Eol married Aradel, Fingolfin's daughter, and their son was Maeglin. Eol is called a dark elf because he never saw the light of the two trees and refused the summons to Valinor. Beren is a man, Turin is a man, Húrin is a man, and Mim is a dwarf. None of these figures belong on a roster of named elves. Gondolin lords were the named elf captains and nobles of Turgon's hidden city. Ecthelion of the Fountain was the captain of one of Gondolin's 12 houses. During the fall of Gondolin, Ecthelion fought Gothmog, lord of the Balrogs, at the fountain in the city's square. He killed Gothmog and died in the same combat, pulling the Balrog into the fountain and drowning with it. Glorfindel of the Golden Flower was the captain of another house. During the escape from the burning city, Glorfindel fought a Balrog on a narrow pass in the encircling mountains. He killed the Balrog and died himself, and his body was buried by the eagles under a cairn of stones. Glorfindel's death and later return to Middle-earth is a subject Tolkien addressed in late writings, and the later legendarium treats the Glorfindel who appears in Rivendell in the Third Age as the same elf who died at Gondolin, returned from the dead by the Valar. Egalmoth was the lord of the House of the Heavenly Arch, and carried a blue shield. He survived the fall of Gondolin, and led refugees southward. Galdor of the Tree was the lord of the House of the Tree, and fought alongside Egalmoth during the escape. Duelin of the House of the Swallow was an archer who died during the fall, shot by a Balrog's fire. Penlod was the lord of 2 houses, the Tower of Snow and the Pillar of Heaven, and is named among the defenders who fell during the city's capture. Rog was the lord of the House of the Harp and is described as a cowardly figure who hid during the fighting. He was killed during the fall. Voronwë was an elf of Gondolin who had been sent by Turgon to sea to seek passage to Valinor. He failed in his mission and was rescued by Ulmo, who sent him back to guide Tuatha to Gondolin. Voronwë led Tuatha through the marshes and the mountains to the hidden city, and he survived the fall. Elemekil was the captain of the guard at the outer gates of Gondolin, who first encountered Tuatha and Voronwë and escorted them into the city. Maeglin's betrayal of Gondolin to Morgoth was the act that exposed the city's location. Maeglin had been captured by orcs while outside the city walls and was brought before Morgoth, who promised him Idril and the rule of Gondolin in exchange for the city's location. Maeglin revealed the approach routes and the layout of Gondolin's defenses. Tuatha, who married Idril and led the defense of the city alongside the elf lords, is a man, not an elf. Círdan's kin includes the named elves connected to the Falas, the western coast of Beleriand, and the later Grey Havens. Círdan the Shipwright ruled the Falas, the coastal region around the havens of Brithambar and Eglarest. He was one of the Teleri who remained in Middle-earth when Elwë was lost, and he never went to Valinor. Círdan's skill was in shipbuilding and seamanship, and his havens served as a refuge and a port throughout the First Age. After the fall of the Falas to Morgoth's forces, Círdan retreated to the Isle of Bala and maintained a remnant of his people there. In the Second and Third Ages, he ruled the Grey Havens at Mithlond on the Gulf of Lune. Windor was an elf of Nargothrond, not of Círdan's direct household, but his story connects to the western coast. He was captured in the Dagor Bragolach and taken to Angband. He escaped after years of captivity and returned to Beleriand changed, diminished in body and spirit. Gelmir, who is named in the narrative, was Windor's brother and died before him. Gelmir was captured by Morgoth's forces and was killed by orcs at the marshes of Seresh in a calculated act of cruelty designed to provoke the Noldor before the Noediad. Gwyndor saw his brother's death from the battlefield and charged forward in grief, breaking the Noldoran battle line. Arminas and a mother elf named Gelmir, a different Gelmir from Gwyndor's brother, came to Nargothrond to warn Eredrith of the danger that the bridge and the open warfare posed to the city. This Gelmir and Arminas were elves of the seacoast, connected to Círdan's people, and their warning went unheeded. Gilin was Gwyndor's father, named in the narrative as the parent of Gwyndor and the Gelmir who died at Seresh. Amiel was an elf of the Grey Elves of Mithrim, who sheltered Tuor in his youth. Tuor lived among Aniel's people for a time before leaving to seek the sea. Galdor of the Heavenly Arch is an elf lord of Gondolin, distinct from Galdor of Hador's house, who is a man. Haldir of the Haladin is also a man, not an elf, and shares a name with the Haldir of Lorien who appears in the Third Age. Gil-galad was the High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth during the Second Age. His parentage varies across Tolkien's writings, and the published narrative does not settle the question definitively. He is called the son of Fingon in some texts, and the son of Orodreth in others, and the late legendarium contains further adjustments. The narrative treats his parentage as unresolved. Gil-galad ruled from Lindon, the coastal region of northwestern Middle-earth that survived the War of Wrath. Círdan remained at the Grey Havens, which were within Gil-galad's domain, and the two worked together throughout the Second Age. Elrond served Gil-galad as his herald and was present at the great battles of the late Second Age. After Gil-galad's death, Elrond founded Rivendell, Imladris, as a refuge for the remaining elves of the north. Galadriel and Celebrimbor were the other major Eldar figures in the west during the Second Age. Galadriel had survived the First Age and established herself in Lothlorien by the Third Age. Celebrimbor was a Sindarin elf, and his lineage is described in the narrative as connected to Thingol's house, though the exact details vary. Gil-galad, Elendil and Elrond formed the last alliance of elves and men against Sauron in the final years of the Second Age. Gil-galad and Elendil fought Sauron on the slopes of Mount Doom, and both died. Gil-galad was killed by the heat of Sauron's hand, and his death marked the end of the Noldorin high kingship in Middle-earth. Elrond witnessed the combat and survived. Elendil and Isildur are men, not elves, and their role in the last alliance is part of the human narrative, not the elven roster. Gil-galad's spear was called Aeglos, and his shield bore the device of stars. He was the last elf to hold the title of High King in Middle-earth, and no successor was named after his death. Celebrimbor was the son of Cuiviénen and the grandson of Fëanor. He ruled the craftsmen of Eregion, the elven realm in the west of Middle-earth near the gates of Khazad-dûm. Eregion was founded in the Second Age by elves who had come from Lindon and who sought the friendship of the dwarves of Moria. Celebrimbor was the greatest smith among them and the heir to Fëanor's craft tradition. Sauron came to Eregion in the Second Age, calling himself Annatar, Lord of Gifts. He presented himself as an emissary of the Valar and offered to teach the elves the arts of ring-making. Celebrimbor and the smiths of Eregion accepted his instruction and began forging the rings of power. Sauron's goal was to bind the elves to his will through the rings, and his plan required that the rings be linked to a master ring that he would forge himself. Celebrimbor forged the three rings, Narya, Nenya, and Vilya, without Sauron's direct involvement. The three were made last and were the greatest of the elven rings. They were not touched by Sauron's hand, but they were still bound to the scheme of the One Ring, because the craft that produced them had been learned from Sauron's teaching. When Sauron forged the One Ring in Mount Doom and spoke the incantation that would bind the others, the elves sensed his purpose and removed their rings. Celebrimbor hid the three and sent them away. Sauron discovered the deception and attacked Eregion. He captured Celebrimbor and tortured him for the location of the rings. Celebrimbor gave up the locations of the lesser rings, but refused to reveal where the three had been sent. Sauron had him killed. Celebrimbor did not forge the One Ring. The one was Sauron's creation alone, made in the fires of Eredruin. Celebrimbor's death ended the elven craft tradition of Eregion and scattered the rings of power into the hands of different peoples across Middle-earth. Galadriel's Court. In Lothlorien during the late Third Age included named elves who appear in The Lord of the Rings. Galadriel and Celebrimbor ruled Lorien together. Earlier rulers of the Wood included Amdir, who led the Elves of Lorien into the War of the Last Alliance and died in the Battle of Dagorlad alongside Gil-galad. Amroth was Amdir's son and ruled Lorien after his father's death. Amroth's story ends in tragedy. He loved Nimrodel, an elf maiden of Lorien, and when she fled the wood, he pursued her. He waited for her at the port of Edhelond on the southern coast, and when she did not arrive, he tried to swim to a ship that was departing without him and drowned. Nimrodel is tied to Amroth's tragic voyage through her absence and his desperate attempt to find her. Haldir, Rúmil, and Orofin are named Elves of Lorien who appear in the Fellowship of the Ring. Haldir was a march warden who guarded the borders of Lorien and encountered the Fellowship when they arrived from Moria. He led them through the wood to Caras-Galadhon, the city of Galadriel and Celeborn. Rúmil and Orofin were Haldir's brothers and served as wardens alongside him. In Peter Jackson's film adaptation of The Two Towers, Haldir appears at the Battle of Helm's Deep and is killed there. This death is a film-only edition. In Tolkien's book, Haldir does not travel to Helm's Deep and is not killed there. The book Haldir remains in Lorien, and his fate after the War of the Ring is not described in detail. The film and book chronologies for Haldir must be kept separate. Thranduil's house ruled the woodland realm of northern Mirkwood. Orofer founded the woodland realm and established his people in the mountains of Greenwood the Great. He was a Sindarin elf who had come from the west, and he led his followers east of the Misty Mountains to settle in the forests. Orofer was killed in the War of the Last Alliance at the Battle of Dagorlad, where he led a charge too soon and was cut down with many of his people. Thranduil succeeded his father as king of the woodland realm. He ruled from underground halls in northern Mirkwood and maintained his kingdom through the long years of the Third Age. Thranduil's realm was diminished by the spread of darkness from Dol Guldur, Sauron's fortress in southern Mirkwood, and his people lived under constant threat from orcs and spiders. Legolas was Thranduil's son. He was sent to Rivendell as a messenger after Gollum escaped from Thranduil's custody, and at the Council of Elrond he was chosen as one of the 9 walkers of the Fellowship. Legolas carried a bow and a knife and fought alongside Aragorn and Gimli throughout the War of the Ring. The book gives no name for Legolas's mother and no fixed age for Legolas himself. Estimates based on contextual clues vary, but the narrative does not state a specific number. Legolas did not fight in the Battle of 5 Armies in the book. That battle involved Thorin's company, the men of Esgaroth, the Elves of Mirkwood under Thranduil, the Goblins, and the Wargs, but Legolas is not named as a participant. Tauriel is a character created for Peter Jackson's Hobbit films. She is named as a captain of the Woodland Realm Guard and plays a significant role in the film narrative. She has no source in Tolkien's published books and is identified here as a film-only edition. She is not part of Tolkien's book roster of named elves. Elrond's house was the last great elven household in Middle-earth. Elrond was a Peridhel, a half-elf, the son of Eärendil and Elwing. He chose to be counted among the elves, while his brother Elros chose to be counted among men and became the first king of Númenor. Elros is not an elf and does not belong on this roster. Elrond founded Rivendell, Imladris, in the Second Age after the death of Gil-galad. He gathered around him a household of named elves who appear in The Lord of the Rings. Arwen was Elrond's daughter. She was called Undumil, the Even Star, and her choice to marry Aragorn and accept mortality was a central event in the late Third Age. She relinquished her elven immortality and passed into the human world, dying in Lothlorien after Aragorn's death. Elladan and Elrohir were Elrond's twin sons. They rode with the Dunedain of the North and participated in the War of the Ring. The narrative does not state whether Elladan and Elrohir chose to remain as elves or to accept mortality. Their final choice is left unstated, and any definitive answer would exceed the text. Glorfindel was an elf of Rivendell who appears in The Lord of the Rings. He rescued Frodo from the Nazgûl at the ford of Bruinen and was one of the most powerful elves remaining in Middle-earth. The late legendarium identifies this Glorfindel as the same elf who died fighting the Balrog at the fall of Gondolin and was returned to Middle-earth by the Valar. This explanation was Tolkien's later writing, and it connects the First Age Glorfindel of the Golden Flower with the Third Age Glorfindel of Rivendell as a single returned figure. Erestor was a counsellor in Elrond's house and participated in the Council of Elrond. Lindir was an elf of Rivendell who appears briefly in the narrative, present at Bilbo's recitation of his poem about Eärendil. Gildor Inglorian was an elf of Rivendell who encountered Frodo, Sam and Pippin in the Shire on the first night of their journey. He and his company were travelling through the Shire on their way west, and he gave the hobbits shelter and warned them of the Black Riders. Gildor's meeting with the hobbits is the first encounter with an elf in the Lord of the Rings narrative proper. Celeborn's final fate has variants in Tolkien's writings. In one version, he remained in Middle-earth after Galadriel's departure and did not immediately sail west. In another, he eventually followed her. The text does not give a single definitive account of his departure, and the question of whether he ever sailed to Aman is left with variant possibilities rather than a settled answer.